Our guest this week is Omnia Marzouk of Initiatives of Change, known to you in the Middle East as Moral Rearmament. We'll be discussing the four freedoms, the four absolutes, and Islam. Well, welcome to the English Hour on ANN Television. Our guest today is Omnia Marzouk. Omnia is head of Initiatives of Change, known to you and I in the Middle East as Moral Rearmament. And she is, well, she's quite a lady. She's Egyptian, Egyptian by heritage. She lives in the UK now. She's a doctor. We will talk about the issue of moral rearmament, particularly with regard to the four absolutes. More about that in a moment. We'll also talk about the issue of the four freedoms, which are dear to my heart. Roosevelt's four freedoms. You know them all. Freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom of religion, and freedom of expression. And at last but not least, by no means least, we'll talk about Islam and what Islam means for Omnia. Omnia, thank you so much for being with us today on ANN Television. We're going to, we will go to a short video package before we start our discussion, so bear with us for a moment. Islam is one of the world's three great monotheistic religions. Of them all, it is the youngest by several centuries, and its adherents are living in turbulent times. Muslims believe that Islam is a 21st century faith which has the potential to address the contemporary world's sorest points. Overcoming suspicion of Islam is a pertinent 21st century challenge facing the US and the West as it attempts to mend a decade of deteriorating ties with Muslims worldwide. Moral rearmament is an international moral and spiritual movement. It is based around what it calls the four absolutes: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love, and encourages its members to be actively involved in political and social issues. One of the movement's core ideas was that changing the world starts with seeking change in oneself. The four freedoms were goals articulated by United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He proposed four fundamental freedoms that people everywhere in the world ought to enjoy: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Roosevelt's hope was to provide a rationale for why the United States should abandon its isolationist policies that emerged in the aftermath of World War I. Roosevelt critiqued isolationism, saying those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So, Omnia, well, bless your heart for being our guest, and thank you indeed. You're president of Initiatives of Change. Now let's get this clear, because it is still known in Syria and Egypt as by its original name, which is moral rearmament. Now, in Arabic,
التصلح الخلقي.
التسلح
الخلقي.
al-khulaqi. My Arabic is awful, so I'm going to have to learn this. التسلح al-khulaqi. So, moral rearmament is a movement.
Yes,
really.
That's right. It's a network of people. So Initiatives of Change is a worldwide movement. It's present in over 60 countries, and it consists of people of diverse backgrounds, diverse religions, who are working together for change in society. And our fundamental premise is that to achieve change in society, you have to start with yourself. So the starting point of any change that you can make in society is a change in your own personal behaviours and values, and then you can be an agent for change. So our vision is that the world is a just, peaceful and sustainable world where each person has a unique contribution to make because they're listening to the calling of their inner conscience. And what we try to do in different countries is to connect people, to equip them, and to enable them to bring about transformation through changes in their personal lives.
Now, you're Egyptian yourself.
That's right.
Certainly by heritage, although you live in the UK now, and
Yes.
you're a doctor.
Yeah.
And you're president of world president of Moral Rearmament.
Yes.
Tell us. I mean, you've been there for a few years now.
This is my 4th year.
Wow. And well, we'll come back to this. I tell you what. Let's talk about. So that we do things around the other way. Let's talk about Islam first,
Okay.
because you're a Muslim.
That's right.
And it might be interesting to me and to many of our listeners to get your perspective on Islam. What makes Islam, what drives you when it comes to Islam? I mean, you're a traditional Muslim in the sense that you worship with prayer in the normal way?
Yes, so my faith journey and my journey with Initiatives of Change are interconnected, because I met Initiatives of Change when I was 15, and at that point I was Muslim in the sense that I believed in God. I fasted during Ramadan because that was a relatively easy thing to do, but I wasn't observant in terms of praying 5 times a day and really understanding what the essence of my faith was about. And through meeting Initiatives of Change, when I met Initiatives of Change when I was 15, I was the only Muslim in a group of young people who were mostly Christian, who worked with Initiatives of Change. And I was struck by the quality of the people that I met. They had a real faith, and they seemed to walk the talk. So they talked about moral values, the need to apply it in your own life, but they actually lived it in their own lives. They had a really big perspective on the world, but they also started with themselves. So this connection between the way you lived and your impact on the world really struck me. And they talked about 4 absolute standards, which we'll come to later, but I'll mention them anyway. Honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And that if you wanted to change yourself, then a good starting point was to see how your life measured up to these standards. So I was a scientist even at the age of 15. I knew I wanted to be a doctor. So I thought I was going to embark on this experiment, which they talked about. And the basis of the experiment is that you sit in quiet and listen to your inner voice.
As a kind of...
as a reflection and a meditation.
It's a Sufi kind of approach
It's
to...
similar to a lot of traditions which
Yes.
talk about reflection and a prayerful, watchful listening to what is deep inside your conscience. And I looked at my life against these 4 standards, and I really thought that I was okay, really, and wouldn't have much to sort of correct. But the first 2 points that I had, which I wrote down, was that I was jealous of my brother, who was older than me.
You mean you're talking now in your reflections
In my
during your
reflection.
prayer?
So that I was jealous of my brother because he was extrovert, and that although I got angry about corruption, I didn't seem to have a problem with taking money from my father without asking his permission.
Uh-huh.
So it struck me, this sort of point about mirroring in your own life what you want to see in society, and I was really angry about corruption. But this nagging thought that actually you don't apply it in your own life.
Islam today, of course, has become very much a focus for radicalism. Radical Islam has taken off. We have radical Christianity. It's not unusual, and certainly much of Judaism in Israel is quite radical too. It's a feature of today's world. I sometimes wonder whether religion is the problem rather than the answer.
Oh, I don't agree with that. I think if you look at the world, the majority of people of faith who really practice their faith are actually people who wish to live alongside others in a peaceful coexistence and to actually cooperate for the better of their society. I think there are a minority of people who are more radical and extreme in their views, who perhaps grab the news limelight more frequently than those who have moderate views. My own personal journey has been one where my rediscovery of my faith as a Muslim is the anchor of everything that I do. So it isn't just a personal faith, it's how do I practice as a doctor in a way that reflects my faith and that serves God. But also the third conviction that I had when I was young was that I wanted to be a bridge between people who are different, and that my journey of rediscovering my faith through Christians who lived their lives as best they could is an example of how we should be living together in the world. So my life's purpose has been to actually build bridges between people of different cultures and different traditions, alongside my calling to be a doctor and to actually heal children. And as I've travelled the world, I've actually encountered more and more people who are convinced of that approach, rather than encountering people who have an extreme point of view, who believe that we need to go back to being isolated from each other and actually not living and working together.
But the rejection of the other is the feature of today's world. I mean, we're in a world where people are increasingly sectarian, increasingly divisive, and in the Middle East particularly, but certainly in the West as well, we are rejecting more and more the...
I think some of it is just fear. Some of it may be justifiable, but some of it is fear of what's different. Some of it is ignorance and stereotypes about the other. And for all of us, it's a journey of breaking out of those stereotypes, really discovering that the other is the same as us, actually. At a human level, we all aspire for the same things. We all want to live in security. We all want to have a purpose in life. We all want to create communities that work. The challenge is that we cannot do it alone. And also the second challenge is that we cannot do it as a single group, that we actually, the world is so interconnected today that you can't. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, people were more isolated, but now there's no community that isn't a mixed community. And I think the biggest challenge that we face is how do we live peacefully alongside each other and learn to actually cooperate, coexist, and actually better our communities together, because that's the only way that we can do it. I don't think we can do it alone.
And Islam is a religion of... people are looking at, in the West, are looking at Islam today, and they see the rejectionist approach of Daesh very, very visually on their television screens. So is Islam, you feel, is essentially a tolerant faith?
It is. I mean, God could have made us all the same, but he actually created us different so that we would get to know one another and work together. And I think there will always be those who have an extremist agenda and who have a violent agenda. And I don't believe that they speak on behalf of the Islam that I practice and that I know and that I live every day. And I don't believe that they reflect many Muslims around the world who actually want to live in peace and to coexist with those who are different from them. So I think the voices of those who strive for tolerance and who strive for building bridges across divides needs to be heard more. But the extremists don't represent the majority, and in fact you'll probably find that they represent a very small, very vocal and very organised minority, but they're getting most of the media news.
And they would claim to be, I don't know whether Daesh particularly claims to be Salafist, but many do, this concept of back to basic. I mean, they are in a way seeking a simpler version of Islam, but you think that the original Islam as promoted by the Prophet Muhammad in his understanding is not this kind of more radical thing.
No, I don't. I mean, I believe in going back to basics in the sense that we have to actually live our values and live our faith in our day-to-day life. So part of the disconnect is that you have the theology of all our religious tradition, and you then have the actual practice of people. And the gap between what the religion says you should do and how we actually live, that's where the real gap is. So I'm a back to basics person in the sense that I believe that the actual values that we talk about, the quality of our interactions with people, has to be at its best, because the Prophet represented the best conduct. So back to basics from that point of view, that you have to live an honest life, you have to treat others with respect, you have to look at your own motivation, you have to question your own selflessness and your own desires, and apply, really rigorously look at your own application of faith. So back to basics to me is about living the theology of Islam day to day. So in my interactions at work, in the way I treat people in the hospital.
Well, let's talk about moral rearmament. We've touched on it quite extensively, but let's talk about these four absolutes, the four principles. Now they are absolute love, absolute honesty, absolute purity, and absolute selflessness. And these are the kind of, I suppose, the creed of the moral rearmament movement. The absolute love, absolute selflessness, absolute purity, absolute honesty. Absolute honesty, you've already said something of as it resonates for you. We live in a very dishonest world. There's a lot of disinformation out there, a lot of media disinformation, particularly on what's going on in the Middle East today.
It also relates to the issue of corruption, which is rampant everywhere. We tend to think that corruption is an issue in developing countries, but actually it's also an issue in Western countries. How do we get honesty and integrity back into our business communities? How do we have integrity in the economy? And that's back to each individual actually applying it in their own lives before we can expect our systems and our structures to have integrity and honesty. The people who actually work in them have to display those features themselves. So it's not an abstract thought, not just at a personal level, but it's also about in a wider society. Why would we expect our institutions to be honest if we're not honest ourselves?
But okay, honesty I can take. I do think it can be. I sometimes one has to be a little constructive with these ideas. I mean, honesty can be quite confrontational, can't it? If it's not leveled with love and care.
Well, it has to be tempered with selflessness and with purity of motives and with caring for the individual. So it isn't each one in isolation, it's all of them together that actually enable you to interact with people in a compassionate way, but also to have honest conversations. That if you want to break stereotypes of what we think of each other and our differences and our different backgrounds, then we have to have those honest conversations in a caring way that helps each of us see our blind sides and what it is that we're missing. At this recent conference that I was at in America, somebody talked about discovering the awe of the other person.
The awe?
Being surprised by the awe. A-W-E.
Oh, the
being
awe.
awed by other people.
Right, yes.
So sort of being surprised by people and the sort of glimpses of humanity that you see in other people. So how do we approach the other with that sort of sense of excitement about discovering something, not only about them, but also about ourselves and our blind spots that we will discover through those conversations.
So honesty and love. Love, everybody subscribes to love, of course. I mean, what that is...
Well, love is easy if it's people that you like. What's more challenging is to demonstrate love when it's actually people who hurt you.
Daesh, who are executing all sorts of people, Yazidis and Christians and fellow Muslims who they regard as, who they view from a perspective of takfiri, a takfiri approach, because they have betrayed what Daesh believes in. I mean, do we treat people like this with love?
No, I think that's more challenging, and I admit that's challenging even for me, and I've not been harmed by anybody personally. But it's how do we rediscover the humanity that might exist even if somebody is committing wrong? So at some point, we have to free ourselves from hate in order to be able to think that that person, even if they have done wrong, there is something in them that can still be touched and can make them more hopeful, more human, and actually change their opinions and their perceptions. So I don't believe that anybody is beyond the touch of God and being able to be changed in what they do and how they live. No matter how evil they are, they can be touched, and something can change in them that will make them see that what they're doing is wrong. But it is much more challenging in settings like that where huge atrocities have been committed. And I find it challenging to even think that I could find in me the spirit to see that those people have something of humanity in them. But God has created everybody, so there is something that can still be changed, even in people who are capable of extreme evil.
Interesting. So you would, in fact, you'd extend this to a kind of philosophy of forgiveness.
Yes, it's about, first of all, how do you find your own freedom from hate? And then there's the question of how you might reach out to somebody who has personally harmed you in a much more sort of bigger way than the small story that I've recounted, because I've not personally had the sort of persecution that we've been talking about in the Middle East. But it's about first discovering the freedom in ourselves to be free of hate. That then means that you can move one step closer towards reaching out to somebody because you want to actually build a relationship that could lead to forgiveness, healing, and eventually to actually peace. And within that equation of peace, there's the question of justice. So I'm not saying that you don't deal with justice and injustice. In Islam, it's very clear that creating a peaceful society is about achieving justice. So people who have wronged people need to be held to account.
Well, justice is so often retribution, though, isn't it?
But it's not retribution. There's a difference between restitutional justice and retribution, and I certainly don't believe in retribution. I believe in actually creating the climate in which acts of restitution can be given and received, and where it's necessary, of course, to actually subject people to courts and subject them to the law of the land in order to achieve justice. But I don't believe in an eye for an eye. And I certainly don't believe in violence. I'm a doctor, so I spend all my life actually healing and trying to help people. So I can't believe in violence and killing as a means of retribution. We have to move to a society. We're in the 21st century. We've gone to the moon and Mars and beyond, and I have to believe that we are capable of, even in the worst situations, starting to create the climate in which dialogue can take place, in which people of different views and backgrounds can listen to each other and can begin to find even one step towards creating the sort of society in which everybody can live equally and find their own contribution. I can't believe that violence is the only way to achieve even political gains.
Interesting. But you're not are you a pacifist?
No, I'm not a pacifist.
You're not?
I think the biggest example that gives me hope is South Africa, a country where apartheid, so a whole system that demeaned and belittled people because of their colour existed, a whole structure and institution that kept people marginalised, prosecuted. It was in the whole of that society. Violence was clearly evident. The international community put pressure on the South African government and kept putting pressure on the South African government to change its philosophy of life, if you like, its whole, the premise on which the country was built. But at the same time, the change had to come from within, and it had to come from people on each side who, despite a history of violence, either by conducting violence or by condoning violence, whichever side you happen to be on, began to see that another paradigm had to exist in order for the country to actually move to a peaceful situation. And they followed that with a peaceful transition, with elections, and they also had Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it wasn't just, let's forget the past, but there was a need to acknowledge what had happened in the past and for people to actually find and receive justice. So that's the sort of model that gives me hope that actually that can happen anywhere in the world. But you need the international pressure, and you need the people on the inside.
Well, you need the people in leadership on the inside
who will change.
Yeah, because South Africa had Nelson Mandela, and perhaps more importantly, in the context of leading change, it had de Klerk, who was in leadership and was willing to promote change. We lack that in so many countries of the world.
We do, and that's why I believe it's not just leadership that needs to change. There is also change that begins at grassroots level and eventually convinces the leadership that they should change. So it isn't just the responsibility of leadership to actually bring about changes in a country, and you need to work at both levels. And that's one of the things that gives me great hope, and also one of the reasons why I became president of Initiatives of Change.
So we've talked about honesty, we've talked about love, selflessness. There's the great Arab proverb, one I'm particularly fond of, at least it's a Palestinian proverb, I don't know whether it's all over the Middle East, which is, my toothache is worse than 100 dead in Jerusalem. And selflessness is
Selfless to me is about what's your motivation in life? What is it you need to question your motivation, and also think of greater good rather than your own personal advancement. So for me, it's about what is it that makes me want to do something? Is it for my own benefit, or is it for the benefit of other people? So, for instance, when I was asked to be president of Initiatives of Change, I immediately dismissed that idea because I thought it needed to be somebody of position, somebody who was internationally well known. It wasn't something that an ordinary person like me, who's just a doctor working in a hospital, was capable of taking on. But then when I reflected about it in another moment of quiet, I have quite a few of them, the first thought I had was, do you believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're led by their conscience? The second thought I had was, are you willing to serve despite your limitations? And the third point I had was, are you willing to move out of your comfort zone? And to me, that was about selflessness, because it's easy just to be an observer of life. And you can be critical of what goes wrong and what needs to change, but you're an observer on the periphery, not wanting to do anything. It's much more difficult to take the courageous step to move into the centre.
Selflessness, purity is the next. We've had love, we've had honesty, we've had selflessness. Purity.
Purity is about for me, it's about my motivation. Why do I do what I want to do? If you're wanting to create a different society, there's an element of selflessness in that decision to actually go out of your way to create community, to go out of your way to reach out to somebody who's different, even though your instinct is to just stay in your narrow confine and remain in your comfort zone. There's an element of selflessness, and what's your motivation?
Because this resonates a lot, I think, for people today, and obviously people have issues with regard to sexual purity, because we live in certainly in the West and in a world in which we are all exploitative of the other, quite predatory, and that is very much an aspect of society. The whole drive to a predatory attitude between the sexes, which is a problem in the West, I think. And but it's much more than that. There's a rejection of materialism, which we see all around us. And I wonder, I mean, I'm coming back to the same theme in a way, but many of the young men, and we've had the best part of 2,000 now who've gone from Britain, and the best part of 3,000 from France, who go to fight with Daesh and so on, they're accused of being lost souls who don't understand what's going on. But many of them are from very professional families. Some of them are doctors. Indeed, a number of them have been doctors, a remarkable number. And they're going out there to fight and probably to die. And part of that is a seeking for purity. They are rejecting Western values, this decadence that we are all involved in around us.
I think it's back to this idea: do we want to live secluded lives, just with the people who are like-minded, which makes life very simple because you're then not having to be confronted by the others. So as a Muslim who lives in the West, there's a lot about Western culture that I don't buy into, but I would prefer to try and live my life within that context. I think I don't understand what would drive people to go to Syria, but I do know that second and third generation Muslims who live in Europe don't feel part of the communities that they live in. So we talk about equality, fraternity, liberty, but actually we perhaps talk about liberty more than we talk about fraternity and communities. So it's important for everybody to be free, but we don't deal with the social injustices that are in our societies, or the biases that mean that second and third generation Muslims who are British or French or whatever country they come from don't actually feel valued as they are and don't feel part of their communities. So you then search for meaning and for purpose through something out there that might be better. Whereas the challenge is that we need to enable people who value their religion, who want to live it out, who want to contribute to their community, to be able to do that where they are in Europe.
Because I wonder whether Morillon could be, to some degree, an ideological alternative to this kind of extremism. But I wonder to the degree to which this one principle, which MRA seems to adhere to, that of purity, is really one that they still adhere to. Does it? I mean, do you think it? Because that would be that is the one that is vibrantly powerful in today's world.
I mean, I think trying to live those four absolute standards in your daily life, whether you're Christian, Muslim, or of no faith at all, is a challenge. And I think for me it was a liberating experience in being able to live my faith fully within the context of the Western society in which I live. Because I'm not going to tell you how you should live your life, but I will try and live my life in a way that reflects the values of my faith, but still fully in the 21st century with all that society and science and technology has to offer. I don't believe in a faith that means you go back to the past in order to live it out. I think the challenge of all faith communities is how do you live them in the realities and challenges and difficulties and complexity of day-to-day life. And for me, encountering initiatives of change was a way that enabled me to bridge that divide of being a person with a foot in two worlds, but actually very comfortable with both. And it helped me to find that comfort in both being Western, a doctor, scientific, fully living life as it is, but holding on to what I value most about my faith and my tradition and the practices each day of my faith, not just the behaviours as well as the practices of my faith. And I believe you can do that without any contradiction. And moral rearmament, if you go back to, is it an ideology that can counter some of these ideologies? I believe it's a way of life that can, and that can enable people of very different backgrounds and traditions to actually learn and discover the joy of working together to make a difference in society, instead of wanting to be islands separated and not creating society together.
So let's move. I mean, we talked about at some length about moral rearmaments for absolutes. How does this relate? We were going to talk about Roosevelt's four freedoms.
Yeah.
And how does this relate to what we've been talking about? I mean, Roosevelt's four freedoms are, I suppose, the basis of much of the whole concept of human rights, if you like, in the modern world. But they predate the modern concept of human rights. Roosevelt's four freedoms are very, very seminal, and they are, I mean, we've said it, but they are freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of religion, and freedom of expression. And I can see the relationship between absolute honesty and freedom of expression. Freedom of expression, taking that first, is one of the great freedoms we don't have very perfectly anywhere. I mean, in the West, our problem is that we tend to paint pictures where everything's black and white. People wear good hats. They're in good hats or they're in bad hats. There's nobody in between. We can't cope with shades of grey.
Yeah. That's the challenge.
That is certainly with regard to viewing the Middle East, because we are very, very judgmental here in the West of the Middle East. And the Middle East, understandably, is also very judgmental of us. It works both ways. But absolute honesty being translated into freedom of expression, we don't have it, do we? We don't have freedom of expression in today's world, and certainly not in the Middle East.
Certainly not in the Middle East. But it's not... I totally defend absolute freedom of expression, but actually no country, well, in most countries, it's not an absolute freedom. So it's, yes, you have freedom of expression, but it's tempered with, in some countries, so long as it doesn't violate national security. In some countries, it's tempered by, so long as it doesn't incite hatred. So there are qualifications. So it's an absolute freedom. It's a freedom of expression, but it's not unqualified. And it depends where you draw the line on it actually affecting national security or inciting hatred, how much you will allow. And even things like the right to assembly and the right to peaceful demonstrations, in most countries that is a right, provided you let the authorities know, obtain a permit, because they have to decide whether you're going to disrupt traffic or disrupt other people's feeding.
Britain now.
So there are always qualifications, but absolutely everybody should be able to say what they think, what their views are about the world, without actually losing their life for that. So I think it's Voltaire who said, I defend your right. I don't agree with what you say, but I defend your right to say it. But equally, I think the West, because you're talking about misconceptions, so we have to become less touchy about what people might be saying about Islam, and more tolerant, and trying to find ways of helping people to understand why we hold things dear and why things are important to us. People in the West need to understand why we're sensitive to some of these issues. So, for example, satire and the use of cartoons and satire to actually have a go at people. The origin of satire is that it's supposed to make people in power question what they do, because it expresses it in a way that takes them a bit by surprise. I don't think that the actual origin of satire is that it mocks the belief of the powerless people. So if you disagree with what how Islam is practiced today, I would say you have the right to satire the religious leaders of today, but you may not have the right necessarily to mock the origin of that faith. So there are boundaries that actually need to be observed, because absolute freedom of expression, if it really affects people's fundamental beliefs, there's a tempering, and there's also a double standard that shouldn't be applied, but I don't want to go into that particular situation, because there were double standards about the particular situation that happened in France.
In the Charlie Hebdo case, yes. Yeah. I still come back to this thing, is religion part of the problem? But you think
I think to me, I mean, if I'm thinking what do I hope for in the Middle East? So to me, the litmus test of a successful society and a successful government is that it safeguards people. They are protected and not afraid, that they have a standard of living, and the government uses all that is available to ensure that their social well-being is looked after. So the economic prosperity, that means people have a standard of living that enables them to meet their needs and meet their family needs and have some aspirations and hope for their children. And the other thing that I think is important for any government is this litmus test of how do we treat minorities that live amongst us? And do we treat them with respect and give them the same freedoms that we have in our own communities? So the litmus test of a government that is effective is one that provides for its people, that makes them live in peace with a standard of living that enables them to meet their needs, but also that we treat minorities with respect and guarantee their security. And we're a long way away from that at the moment, but we can hope that, because democracy, I mean, in the West took 200 years to have their democratic societies of today. My hope is that many of the countries around the world that don't have democracy won't take quite so long, but it will take more than a few years for actually democratic processes to be present in many of our countries.
I mean, governments caring for people, I mean, freedom from want. We live in a situation, a third of Roosevelt's freedoms are scarcely being honoured, is it? You look at the refugee camps outside Syria, the squalid conditions, the miserable lives that people have in Lebanon and Turkey, who are refugees from Syria. Despite pledges of billions from the international community, none of it gets through, largely because it's not a priority. There's a lot of dishonesty there, if you're talking about honesty.
But also we have, I mean, let's not forget that we have food banks here in Britain, so there are people in need even in this country, as well as the refugees in other countries. So there are double standards about how we apply that, but certainly there's more that needs to be done for the refugees in the different countries, and to ensure that we don't see people dying simply because they hope for something better in their lives and because they are fleeing situations that are deplorable, and which, if you have no hope, then anything is better than that. So we shouldn't be surprised that people want to come to Europe. But how do we tackle the root causes? And there are multi-layered causes to the problems, because they're very different countries, and the political situations that cause people to leave are very varied in different countries.
And the final freedom of Roosevelt, anyway, was freedom from fear. Very hard to deliver, but again, we live. I suppose one of the beauties of selflessness, if you can be selfless, is that it removes fear, because fear is largely selfish, it's self-oriented. But we do live in a world completely full of fear.
Well, it goes back to the sort of, if you go back to even the First World War, when the thinking for the League of Nations and the United Nations came about, it was an attempt by the international community to create a new world order, where actually problems were solved peacefully by cooperation. And we're still quite a way away from that even now, and we're more than 100 years after the event. I think there has to be a realization that violence and killing will never in the long run succeed in achieving people's long-term goals, and that the only way of doing it is actually by beginning to have a dialogue and beginning to build together, step by step, a journey that will lead to a peaceful solution and to peaceful meeting of people's aspirations. I just don't believe that killing and violence will ever get us there. And we as human beings need to realize that actually it starts with ourselves at a very basic level, and that we need to ask our leaders to actually use violence as a last resort in order to achieve their means.
Bless you, Omnia. So, Omnia, you have a book you've brought us, Leadership on the Line, Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Leading, by Ronald Heifetz, isn't it?
Yes.
Heifetz and Marty Linsky. Sounds American.
It is.
Okay. And it's what is this, one of these self-help books, or?
It's a very interesting book about leadership, really. And I don't believe leadership, and it brings in stories from all levels of leadership, so political leadership, leadership in business, and actually ordinary people who are wanting to lead change in their communities. And it is a self-help book, but it's also very practical. So a few things that I found very interesting about it, as I try and discern how, as an ordinary person, you demonstrate leadership in a small way. So it's, if you want to bring about change in whatever situation you find yourself in, it's how do you differentiate between the technical problems, which can be solved by technology, versus the issues that need adaptation. So they talk about adaptive change, which is things that need to change, but they require a change in people's attitudes, their culture, their behaviours in order to create something different. And it's much easier to deal with the technical issues than it is to deal with the issues of change that relate to adaptive change. So some of the tips that they talk about is how, if you are wanting to bring about change in your setting, they talk about sort of looking at the view from the balcony as well as dancing on the floor. So it's how do you, because you can't be a spectator, you've got to be a participator if you want to bring about change. So how do you every now and again detach yourself to actually look down at what you're trying to do in order to discern trends, in order to discern behaviours that might be impeding your ability to bring about change. So it's interesting to try and think in the situations that we deal with day to day, what's technical, what's adaptive, how much is my view looking down, how can I actually discern what the next steps are. And then it's quite interesting in the way it talks about dealing with conflict, that some of the things that stop us from actually being able to change the situations that we're in is conflict, but it's conflict which is under the surface and not expressed. So how do you create the safe space in which the conflict and the sense of loss or the sense of fear that people have about what you propose to do can be expressed in a safe space that enables you to make the breakthroughs that bring about change. And then the bit that I haven't got to yet in the book is actually the things that you as a leader can do to sustain yourself in a leadership role. So it's quite interesting because the title says Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Leading, because actually anybody who takes on a leadership role, whether it's very small in their own families and in their own communities, you are exposing yourself to danger because people don't want to change the way they do things. So if you're trying to bring about change, you need to be anchored, and you need to find the resources that will enable you to sustain yourself as you try and lead in whatever setting you're in. So,
bless you. I'll read it with interest. This is mentioning again Leadership on the Line, Staying Alive Through the Dangers of Leadership by Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky. So very interesting indeed. Omnia, thank you. And thank you for being our guest on ANN. It's been a joy and a privilege to have you with us.
Thank you.
Many, many thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.